The stage was blinding beneath the television lights, heat rising off the floor as if the room itself knew something volatile was about to erupt. Cameras panned with hungry precision, every lens focused on the two women at center stage. Then, without warning, Kamala Harris's voice tore through the auditorium. She wasn't debating, she was shouting. Her words, sharp and furious, cracked like a whip across the air. A sudden explosion from the Vice President of the United States, bellowed not at an opponent from across the aisle, but directly at Jasmine Crockett. The sound silenced everything else. The crowd froze in disbelief. Phones hovered midair, recording, as if hands had been locked in place. Murmurs rippled, broken only by the insistent staccato of cameras clicking, each flash burning the moment into permanent record. Viewers at home, millions of them, leaned closer to their screens, eyebrows raised, hearts racing. It was a scene no one expected. The second most powerful woman in the country, abandoning composure, her voice cracking with visible rage. The words themselves almost didn't matter. What mattered was the sight. The vice president, so often framed as polished and calculated, reduced in that instant to pure shouting. Her hands gestured wildly, her tone drowning out every other sound. Across the stage, Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't flinch. Her silence was louder than Harris's scream. She stood as if rooted to the ground, eyes fixed, posture unbroken. And in that stillness was something undeniable: power. Gasps traveled through the audience like electricity. Disbelief carrying from one row to another. A man in the front clasped his hands to his mouth. A woman in the back shook her head, whispering to the stranger beside her. The air had shifted. Everyone knew they had just witnessed a line being crossed, a moment raw enough to mark history. And, yet, the silence after Kamala's voice faded felt even heavier. Cameras zoomed in, waiting for Crockett's response. Would she rise? Would she lash out? Would she match fire with fire? She didn't blink. She didn't even raise her voice. What happened next would leave the room breathless, the cameras scrambling, and the nation stunned. Because no one could predict how JasmineCrockett's.com razor-sharp reply would flip the entire stage upside down. It wasn't just another town hall. The night had been billed as a showcase of vision, a stage where voices from across the democratic spectrum would collide and, perhaps, coalesce. Under the vaulted lights, the atmosphere carried the weight of expectation. Networks hyped it as a glimpse of the party's future, while millions of Americans tuned in hoping for clarity, leadership, and maybe even a spark of inspiration. Every word spoken here mattered, not only to those seated in the packed auditorium but to households scattered across the country, where families leaned forward on couches, waiting to see which figure would rise, and which would falter. The stakes were monumental. For Kamala Harris, this was no casual appearance. She walked onto the stage with the title of Vice President etched beside her name, but titles can be fragile things. Behind the applause lingered an unspoken question. Could she carry the mantle of leadership without faltering under pressure? With the eyes of the nation upon her, every syllable she spoke was measured against her future ambitions, her credibility, and her ability to command respect on the grandest stage. Across from her stood Jasmine Crockett, a figure with far less institutional power but far more momentum than many had anticipated. Rising steadily through the ranks, Crockett had become known for her fearless advocacy, her ability to cut through noise with sharp clarity, and her grounding in the struggles of ordinary people. Where Harris carried the weight of establishment authority, Crockett carried the energy of authenticity, the magnetic pull of someone who spoke as if she belonged to the people, not above them. That collision, authority versus authenticity, wasn't just political theater. It was a litmus test for the direction of a party and the heartbeat of a country. Would the future belong to voices polished by institutions, or to leaders who seemed to draw their strength from raw truth and lived experience? Every viewer knew the answer mattered, because in a season of turbulence, the face that could carry trust and conviction might very well carry the nation forward. The tension between Harris and Crockett didn't erupt out of nowhere. It had been simmering beneath the surface all night, each exchange edged with more heat than the last. Harris, cornered by the expectations of being the seasoned veteran, felt the weight of having to dominate the room. Crockett, with less to lose but far more to gain, answered calmly, directly, refusing to cede an inch. Their words collided like sparks against stone, each response escalating the pressure. The moderators tried to guide the discussion, but the spotlight had already narrowed to two figures locked in a duel of presence. Harris's jaw tightened with every response Crockett delivered. Crockett, steady, seemed to grow stronger with each interruption she endured, And in that electric current, the audience could sense it. The clash was bigger than two women. It was about credibility, leadership, and what kind of voice would define the next era of American politics. Every second ticked with a strange urgency, as if history itself were watching. This wasn't just rhetoric, it was a contest over who could embody dignity under fire. Who could withstand the glare without cracking? Viewers didn't dare look away. Because what was about to unfold wasn't just a clash of words, it was a defining moment in American politics. And it all began with one insult Kamala never should have uttered. Kamala Harris's rise through American politics was anything but quiet. From the earliest days of her career, she carried a reputation for fiery exchanges, razor-sharp questioning, and a presence that could dominate any stage. In Senate hearings, she was the figure who cut through hesitation with rapid-fire interrogation, leaving witnesses stumbling over their own words. In debates, she thrived on confrontation, the candidate whose interruptions were framed as moments, crafted for the highlight reel. To her supporters, it was strength. To her critics, it often looked like theater and energy that burned bright but not always steady. Her debate style became a signature, pressing, relentless, sometimes overwhelming. She was quick to interject, her tone brimming with authority, her pace accelerating until it bordered on breathless. But within that forcefulness lay a vulnerability. When pressed beyond her rehearsed lines, Harris could stumble into what commentators came to label her word salads, answers. So winding and layered with filler phrases that clarity often evaporated. What should have been her greatest weapon? The sharpness of a prosecutor's voice, sometimes unraveled into meandering statements that left her audience puzzled rather than persuaded. These moments, small in isolation, accumulated into a larger picture. For every commanding stage performance, there was a clip replayed online of Harris trailing off mid-answer, appearing flustered or evasive. For every headline that praised her toughness, another critiqued her for arrogance. She projected confidence, but the cracks were visible. And in politics, cracks become openings for doubt. Her contradictions didn't end at style. Harris, the champion of justice in one chapter, was often criticized for the compromises of her prosecutorial record in another. She spoke the language of reform. Yet her past decisions as California's Attorney General haunted her with accusations of inconsistency. To some, she embodied the establishment's double standard, progressive in tone, cautious in action. That duality, powerful speeches paired with muddled policies, left her perched in a precarious space. She was celebrated at the top of the political hierarchy. Yet her footing felt uncertain whenever the ground shifted beneath her. Over the years, flashes of arrogance surfaced, not as calculated strategy but as instinctive reactions. In interviews, when pressed with uncomfortable questions, she sometimes responded with dismissive laughter, a gesture that alienated as much as it amused. In debates, her interruptions could silence others, but not always with grace. That instinct to dominate, to control the room, worked until it didn't, until the very force she relied upon turned brittle under pressure. On this night, under the searing glare of stage lights, those patterns re-emerged. When Jasmine Crockett's composure contrasted so sharply with Harris's volatility, it triggered a familiar cycle. The vice president leaning into power, not through persuasion, but through volume. Her shout was not simply about the words hurled across the stage. It was the culmination of years of leaning on force rather than balance, image rather than consistency. And yet, for all her flaws, Harris's power could not be dismissed. She carried history with her, the first woman of color to serve as vice president, a symbol of achievement, representation, and barrier breaking. She stood tall on accomplishments that few could rival, but power without steadiness can feel fragile, and on nights like this, fragility shows. The crowd that watched her scream didn't see a polished leader commanding the stage. They saw the thin line between strength and desperation. It was the risk Harris had always faced. The tendency to overreach, to let force overshadow substance, to let passion slip into volatility. In the silence after her outburst, the cameras captured not just her anger but her unease. For years, she had been able to dominate moments by sheer intensity, but intensity alone was no longer enough. Against someone unshaken, unflinching, her energy became a mirror reflecting her own brittleness, because across the stage stood a woman forged from battles Kamala could never imagine. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive on that stage by accident. Her journey was carved out of courtrooms, community halls, and the kind of battles that don't make headlines but change lives all the same. Long before she stood beneath national lights, Crockett was an attorney whose voice carried the weight of those who had none. She had fought in cramped courtrooms where the odds tilted heavily against her clients, where power and privilege seemed to dictate the outcome before a single word was spoken, and yet, word by word, motion by motion, she carved cracks into those walls of inequality. As a lawyer, she was known less for theatrics and more for relentlessness. She defended those targeted unfairly, those too often silenced or overlooked. Her cases weren't glamorous, they were grueling. But through each one, she built a reputation for standing firm against systems designed to wear people down. To her, the courtroom wasn't a place for prestige, it was a battlefield for dignity. That commitment carried into her political life. When she stepped into the public arena, she didn't shed her advocate's skin. She amplified it. In every committee hearing, in every floor speech, she carried the echoes of the voices she once represented in court. She wasn't polished in the way Washington often demands, but that was her strength. She was raw, unfiltered. A truth-teller in spaces where truth was often bent or buried. The struggles that shaped her gave her a different kind of armor. As a black woman in America, as an attorney challenging entrenched power, as a representative refusing to dilute her convictions, she faced the scrutiny that comes with being unapologetic in spaces unaccustomed to it. There were headlines that dismissed her, commentators who mocked her directness, colleagues who underestimated her. Yet time after time, she answered not with apology but with persistence. And still, there was something more subtle that defined her. Crockett's power didn't come from constant fire. It came from knowing when to hold it back. She could scorch a room with her words when needed, but she understood that fire loses its impact if it burns without purpose. What truly set her apart was her commeasured, deliberate, almost unnerving in its steadiness. That calm wasn't the absence of passion. It was the product of discipline, of knowing that true strength isn't about raising your voice, but about refusing to be shaken when someone else raises theirs. Her colleagues learned quickly that underestimating her was a mistake. In hearings, when tempers flared and others shouted, Crockett would sit still, letting silence become her shield. And then, at just the right moment, she would deliver her point with surgical precision sharp enough to cut through noise, calm enough to expose the imbalance of everyone else. It wasn't just her words that carried weight, but the way she wielded them, as if she understood that restraint could sometimes be louder than rage. This composure was not innate. It had been earned through years of being tested, of walking into spaces where she was expected to shrink and choosing instead to expand. It was the product of holding her ground in the face of dismissive tones, condescending smirks, and systemic pushback, where others might have broken. She learned to bend without losing shape, so when she walked onto that debate stage opposite Kamala Harris, Crockett carried more than talking points. She carried the weight of those struggles, the steadiness of her discipline, the lessons of every courtroom and committee room that had taught her when to unleash fire and when to let silence speak. The audience didn't know her full story, but they felt it. They saw it in her posture, in the way she didn't flinch when challenged, in the way her eyes didn't dart for escape but locked onto her opponent with steady resolve. There was an authenticity to her presence, a sense that she wasn't performing for applause or headlines, but standing for something deeper, and that is why the confrontation carried so much weight. Harris, with her authority and her title, was expected to dominate. Crockett, with her grit and her steadiness, was expected to hold her own. But no one anticipated what would happen when the two forces collided, because when Kamala's voice cracked into a scream, Crockett's silence became her most powerful weapon. The moment Kamala's first shout broke across the stage, it was as though the air itself shifted. What had started as a structured exchange unraveled into something raw, something unrestrained. She cut across the moderator mid-quish, her voice pitched higher than the microphones could comfortably hold, her hand raised as if to swat the air. The words tumbled fast, sharp, and unrelenting. "You don't understand the weight of leadership," she barked, her tone more accusation than argument. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She kept her gaze steady, her posture unshaken, even as Harris leaned forward, her sentences layered with interruptions. The moderators attempted to regain control, but the stage was no longer theirs. Harris spoke, over them, over the crowd, over the very structure of the debate. As though sheer force of will could drown out every other sound, it became more than a debate. It was a spectacle of frustration, laid bare. Each time Crockett began to answer, Harris's voice returned, louder, sharper. The audience leaned forward, torn between discomfort and fascination. Murmurs swept through the room. A few clapped tentatively when Harris landed a line heavy with condescension. But the applause faded quickly, smothered by the unease settling across the auditorium. The escalation carried a pattern. Crockett would open her mouth to respond. Harris would interject before she finished her first sentence. At one point, Harris jabbed her finger toward Crockett, her voice nearly cracking with exasperation. This isn't about speeches, it's about responsibility. Something you clearly don't understand. The room shifted again. Gasps rang out, followed by a silence so taut it was almost physical. The attack had turned personal, no longer cloaked in policy or politics, but sharpened into a blade aimed directly at Crockett's dignity. People in the crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even those predisposed to Harris winced at the spectacle, recognizing the thin line between assertiveness and desperation. And still, Crockett did not flinch. She stood rooted, shoulders squared, her lips pressed together in patient restraint. Her calm was unnerving, as though she were absorbing Harris's fury and holding it in suspension, letting it burn itself out. With each interruption, each raised decibel, Crockett seemed to grow steadier, her silence becoming its own statement. The longer she held back, the more obvious the contrast became. Harris's energy was frantic, brittle at the edges. Crockett's composure was deliberate, almost surgical. The audience felt it, the pressure building like steam in a sealed chamber, waiting for the inevitable release. A journalist in the front row whispered to a colleague, "She's waiting. She's letting Kamala hang herself with every word." The colleague nodded, eyes fixed on the stage. They weren't the only ones who sensed it. Across the hall, heads tilted, breaths held. The moment was tilting toward something bigger than interruption or insult. Harris pushed harder, her frustration spilling into barbs about Crockett's experience, her qualifications, her place on that stage. "You haven't carried what I've carried," Harris thundered. "You haven't faced what I've faced. And frankly, you don't belong lecturing me on leadership." The last line landed with a thud, not applause. The audience shifted again, the discomfort now undeniable. Viewers at home felt it through their screens of Vice President attacking not just a position but a person, revealing a crack in her own composure. Crockett let the words hang in the air, absorbing them without twitch or tremor. Her stillness now felt electric, charged with anticipation. The crowd was caught in the tension, leaning forward, waiting for the inevitable answer. Phones recording shook slightly in the hands of people holding their breath. The silence stretched. Harris looked at her opponent, as if daring her to respond. And then, Crockett finally spoke. The silence before Jasmine Crockett's reply was almost unbearable. For the first time all evening, no one dared to cough, no one dared to shuffle in their seat. It was as if the auditorium itself had frozen in anticipation. Cameras zoomed in, hungry for the moment. Harris stood rigid, chest heaving, eyes locked on her opponent as though sheer intensity could keep her in control of the stage. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She waited, allowed the weight of Harris's words to settle, and then lifted her chin ever so slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, measured, deliberate. "Madam Vice President," she began, pausing just long enough for the crowd to lean forward, "you seem to think that raising your voice makes your point stronger. It doesn't. It only makes your weakness louder." The line landed like thunder. Gasps rippled through the audience, some sharp, some whispered, but all unified in shock. For a brief second, there was stunned silence, then an audible murmur surged across the room, like a wave. Disbelief mingling with awe. On stage, Harris's jaw tightened, her hands gripping the podium as if anchoring herself against the blow. Crockett didn't rush. She let the words breathe. She leaned into the rhythm of a trial lawyer dismantling a witness, piece by piece. "Leadership isn't about shouting people down," she continued, her tone steady, almost surgical. "It's about standing in the fire and refusing to let the flames consume you. I've done that my whole life, not because of a title, but because people's lives depended on it." Every word carried precision. No wasted phrases, no hurried cadence. The audience sat entranced, as though watching a master craftsman at work. Harris tried to interrupt, but Crockett raised a hand. "Come, Furman," the attempt fizzled before it could take flight. "You talk about responsibility," Crockett said, her eyes never leaving Harris. "But responsibility isn't about how loudly you can claim it. It's about accountability. Accountability to the people, accountability to truth, accountability to justice. And that's not earned by shouting on a stage, it's earned by serving when nobody's watching." The crowd erupted first in scattered applause, then in full-throated cheers. The sound swelled, echoing through the hall, drowning out the cameras were. Some rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, encouragement. Harris shifted, visibly rattled. Her once commanding presence now caught in the shadow of Crockett's calm certainty. And still, Crockett pressed on. Her voice did not rise with the crowd. It remained steady, almost gentle, which somehow made it hit harder. I don't need to match your volume to prove my worth. I don't need to scream to make myself heard. Because strength isn't in the decibel, it's in the discipline. Another wave of applause broke through, the crowd roaring their approval. Crockett waited again, letting the noise crest and settle. She had mastered the tempo of the room, commanding silence and sound with nothing but patience. Then she turned, slightly, addressing the audience as much as Harris. Every time someone tries to tell you that calm is weakness, remember this moment. Because calm is how you win battles without losing your soul. Calm is how you build a future that isn't driven by fear, but by faith. It was more than a rebuttal, it was a sermon, a reframing of the entire confrontation into something universal. Viewers at home felt it in their chests, a validation of dignity over arrogance. Composure over chaos. Harris tried once more to interject, her voice cracking as she leaned forward. Don't lecture me about leadership. But the audience didn't buy it. The words came off brittle, defensive. Crockett simply shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The smile of someone who had already won the argument before it was finished. She turned back to Harris with one final strike. Soft but devastating. Madam Vice President, if you have to scream to be heard, maybe it's because you stopped listening a long time ago. The auditorium exploded. People shot to their feet, clapping, shouting, some even pounding the floor in exhilaration. The moderators sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let history unfold. The sound was deafening cheers, whistles, chants. In the middle of it all, Harris stood rigid, her eyes darting, her practiced composure slipping away. She looked less like a commanding leader and more like someone who had lost control of the very stage she once owned. Crockett, in contrast, stood perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the podium. She didn't gloat, she didn't bask in the chaos. She simply waited, calm as ever, until the noise subsided. That, too, was part of her power, the refusal to overplay a victory. The choice to let the audience carry her message further than she ever could alone. But perhaps the most telling reaction came not from politicians or pundits, but from everyday people. Call-in shows lit up with voices from across the country. A school teacher in Ohio said, "I don't follow politics much, but I saw that clip and wow, Crockett's.com reminded me of the best leaders in my community." A veteran in Texas added, "I've seen enough yelling in my life." What Crockett showed was strength without noise. That's leadership. Clips circulated globally, too. International outlets from London to Tokyo picked up the story, framing it as a uniquely American clash of personalities that nonetheless carried universal resonance, the age-old battle between rage and restraint, volume and virtue. The ripple effect was undeniable. Overnight polls began registering a shift in perception, not dramatic but noticeable. Harris's favorability dipped a few points. Crockett's name recognition surged. More importantly, Crockett wasn't just recognized, she was remembered. People weren't merely aware of her, they were quoting her, sharing her, turning her words into slogans. By morning, the split-screen image of Harris screaming beside Crockett's.com gaze had been shared millions of times. It became the shorthand for the entire event, the distilled essence of the night. One debate, one exchange, and suddenly, the landscape looked different. And yet, amid the chaos, the hashtags, the memes, the celebrity takes, the pundit spin, something deeper lingered. The noise was loud, but behind it was a lesson older than politics itself. That true power isn't in the volume of your voice, but in the steadiness of your character. Cliffhanger. And yet, amid the chaos, one timeless lesson cut through. The dust settled and the noise of the headlines began to fade. One truth remained undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had reframed what power looks like in American politics. She didn't shout over her opponent, she didn't twist her face into anger, and she didn't scramble to match chaos with chaos. Instead, she chose dignity over arrogance, calm over rage, and that choice reshaped the moment into something larger. Then a debate, it became a lesson. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Power isn't in the loudest voice, but in the clearest truth. Across the country, viewers replayed the exchange, not just for its drama, but for its meaning. They saw a leader who refused to be dragged into the mud, who understood that real strength is measured not by how high you can raise your volume, but by how deeply your words can resonate. Crockett's.com reply wasn't passive, it was strategic. It wasn't silence born of fear, it was silence that spoke louder than a scream. And when she finally did speak, her words carried the weight of justice, of discipline, of a life spent standing up for dignity in the courtroom and beyond. That contrast between Harris's eruption and Crockett's measured reply did more than stun a crowd. It exposed the myth that dominance comes from volume. It reminded people that leadership, at its best, is clarity in the storm. This moment wasn't just about politics. It tapped into something deeply American, the belief that the truth doesn't need theatrics to win. From civil rights marches to courtroom victories, history has shown that quiet determination can shake empires louder than any shout. Crockett's composure placed her in that tradition, carrying forward the spirit of those who turned restraint into revolution. For progressives, immigrants, and marginalized communities watching, the moment felt personal. It was validation, the reminder that their power, too, isn't defined by how loudly they demand recognition, but by the undeniable clarity of their presence, their contributions, their truth. Crockett became not just a politician in that moment, but a mirror for those who know what it means to endure noise, insults, and dismissals, and still rise with dignity intact. And so, the debate stage became something larger than itself. It wasn't just a contest of candidates, it was a stage where the American story was retold, a story where arrogance cracked under its own weight, and dignity, quiet but unshakable, stood taller than the scream meant to drown it. The inspirational crescendo was unmistakable. Crockett's reply was more than a defense. It was a reminder that politics can still hold justice, that leaders can still embody grace, and that the American spirit still values character over spectacle. Watching her, millions felt a flicker of pride, not only in her but in what she represented. Because if one calm reply can stun the world, shift narratives, and redraw political maps, then imagine what's coming next. OUTROTS. If one calm reply can stun the world, imagine what's coming next. Kamala screamed. Crockett didn't flinch, and history remembers who stood tall. That single moment, frozen in time under glaring lights and clicking cameras, wasn't just a clash between two women on a stage, it was a lesson written in bold for the nation to see. A lesson about what true strength looks like, about how dignity outlasts rage, and about how clarity always outshines chaos. Jasmine Crockett's calm didn't simply win a round of applause, it planted a seed. It reminded millions that the voices we should lift are not the loudest, but the clearest, that leadership isn't measured in decibels, but in depth, and that when arrogance erupts, composure is the shield that turns the tide. This is how movements begin, not in a roar that quickly fades, but in a steady truth that lingers. The story of Crockett's response will be replayed, requoted, and retold because it speaks to something we've all felt: the urge to defend ourselves with fire, and the wisdom of knowing when silence, followed by truth, can shake the ground more than any shout. And so, this story doesn't end with that debate stage. It lives on in the conversations it sparks, in the dignity it validates, and in the example it sets for anyone who has ever been underestimated, interrupted, or shouted down. Because in the end, power isn't about who screams the loudest, about who speaks the truth that no one can ignore. Subscribe, share, and keep this movement alive, because dignity always deserves the last word.